Hello, everyone, and welcome to Couch Talk. I'm your host, Dr. Anna Cabeca. I am here with Roy Nelson, and today we are going to talk about to hell and back, really, and how Roy is going to share his story, his journey, and his professional occupation about how he helps. He is the source of last resort, how he helps people come back from addiction, recover from trauma, and the layers that he uncovers in the healing process and the layers to healing. So I welcome Roy. How are you today?
Oh, thank you so much. I'm great. I'm so happy to be with you. I've heard so much about you, and I'm really grateful and blessed and pleased to be here with you.
Well, I feel the same. Thank you. Let me tell our listeners about Roy. Roy is known as the last resort for those who cannot stop their self-destructive habits. Living with a violent alcoholic father drove him to pursue a life of distraction by any means possible, until he conceded that his self-imposed hell was killing him. It was then that he had a profound experience that changed everything. Over 35 years ago, Roy cracked the code of his own addictive personality. As a result, he lost 120 pounds and overcame a myriad of addictions, as well as depression, panic attacks, and phobias. Based on his personal experience of total freedom, Roy developed the Nelson Method, a plan of spiritual healing that is designed to help people heal from their own personal hell, even when all other approaches have failed. And Roy, it's so special to be here with you today because for so many women, we live in women and men, where we live in our own personal hell, real or perceived. But in my work, in my experience in working with post-traumatic stress disorder, I think it's really important that we uncover these layers. And I would love for you to share with us, your journey, your beginnings, and how you've lived so many lives.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you very much. Well, my experience, I guess the easiest way to put it, I almost died at birth, and then I kind of went downhill from there. So I was born with a cord around my neck, and I was born at home, and there was no doctor there, and the midwife was there, and eventually the doctor showed up, and I was black and blue and struggling for breath, and so I survived that one. But from that point on, I've been all afraid my entire life. I mean, just absolutely terrified, and very sensitive little kid, very, very, very afraid. And I grew up in a tough place with some tough people, and so I just really wasn't equipped for my environment. One fellow I worked with, he said he was allergic to his life, so I was kind of like that myself, but. God gives us what we need to survive, and so I got through that, and I was raised in poverty and violence, really, and I worked from the time I was a very small child, earning my own spending money and my clothes and lots of things, things that I needed, and so my first escape, my first way of surviving was through fantasy. And that's always the first addiction for people like us like me, who started so young. And when the reality of our lives is too much for us, we have the God gives us, to me, it's like shock. It's like, if you're being a doctor, you understand shock. If we get a gunshot wound to the belly, God gives us the ability to go into shock because it protects us from excruciating pain and the terrible fear that we're going to die. And fantasy is that way. People think of denial and all that type of thing, and that fantasy as a negative. To me, they're absolute gifts. When the reality of our situation is too much, we have the propensity to go into the ability to go into fantasy. And so that's the way I lived for a long time. And then, of course, I used food from the time I was a very small child, always looking for relief. not to be crude here, but from the time I found my penis, it was on. I was obsessed with sex long before I knew what sex was. So, and then of course, I started smoking cigarettes when I was about 12, and I left home when I was 14, and the first, of course, I was always working with people a lot older than me. I mean, the first women I was with were in their 30s, and I was in my 15 or something. And then, the men I worked with are older, and so, it didn't seem. I mean, it just seemed right. I mean, went to the Army the day I was 17, and and I made rank pretty fast. So pretty soon, within a year or so, my peers, the other sergeants, were 15 years older than me, and the way I learned to drink, and they drank. I didn't think I'd ever drink until I drank, until I realized what a drink could do for a fellow like me. And so, because of all I'd experienced as a result of alcohol when I was a kid, I didn't, I totally didn't think I'd ever drink. But I warmed up to it pretty quickly once I realized the magic that could be found in alcohol. And of course, it was always just on. I mean, I was in the Army. I got married when I was 20 to a woman who had a little girl, and a year and a half later we had a little boy, and then a year later, or less than a year later, we had twin boys. So before I was 23 years old, I was a father of 4. So I was just pretty much. It's a good thing I had big shoulders in those days, because I sure as hell needed them. But anyway, so to progress, I got out of the Army when I was 24, and it was really tough because I didn't have any, I came from poverty. I didn't have any background, and really didn't. But eventually I found something I could do that I made, it paid well, and started making money. And then, of course, then it was on to the big house in the country club section, and the big cars, and all the experience, all the things that you think are going to do it for you when you grew up in poverty. And so by the time I was 28 years old, I was making the rounds of psychiatrists for phobias on airplanes and stuff. And I had experienced the claustrophobia before. When I first shipped out to overseas, I was 18 years old and boarded a ship. And down in the hold of the ship, I got claustrophobic. And frankly, even before that, when the first time I was deployed with my outfit for the Cuban crisis down in your area of the country, we were literally facing World War III, but I was more concerned about being cooped up on that airplane on the ride down to Savannah than I was being in World War III. I mean, it was just because of, I don't know, I guess just claustrophobia has always been a default mode, for me. And then, of course, it progresses from there. But eventually, I did the psychiatrist and the doctors and various types of folks for about 4.5 years. And I had so much religious craziness as a child. I didn't think, I mean, I often thought during all the years of insanity how wonderful it would be if only I could believe in God. Mm-hmm. But I already knew there was no God. I was way too smart. You see, that was my problem. But my experience is you get stupid when you're dying, And so in 1976, when it was just absolutely, alcohol stopped working for me. I had so much guilt and remorse over my sex stuff that I couldn't really have any interest, but I was obsessed at the same time. And, I had stopped smoking in October 1976 because my dear wife at the time had stopped, and she didn't think she could stop smoking. And of course, I was a big shot. I knew I could anytime I wanted to, right? But what happened is she stopped smoking, and really just out of concern for her, once she had stopped for a couple of weeks, I realized she was serious about it, and just concern for her, I stopped smoking. And then what happened is my double X big shirt started getting big around the middle, getting tight around the middle, because I put on 15 pounds. I was about 260 was my fighting weight, if you will. And I'm only about that tall. But so next thing you know, I was 275 pounds, and I didn't have any idea where it would stop. So everything combined. I mean, I thought I was so bad, because of what I call religious insanity manifested as sexual insanity. You know, the primary thing they taught me was my sexuality was bad, and the more it was bad, the more I was obsessed. So, you know, anyway, so and frankly, I mean, it all worked together for good, as all things do, because ultimately, it takes what it takes to drive a person like me to my knees. And, you know, and I can be so grateful that it only took what it took, because there's plenty more out there. I know there's plenty more out there. And I know, I mean, my dad, not long before he died, he had a tube in his stomach for feeding because he had actually had esophageal cancer from drinking straight bourbon out of the bottle for many, many years. I'm assuming that's what caused it. A lot of other things he did, but not long before he died, he had a tube in his stomach for feeding, and he poured alcohol into the tube. Now, I had a lot of preconceived ideas about what a drinking problem would look like, and I didn't perceive myself to have one. So fortunately for me, I used alcohol the last several years. I drank as a medication. I had to have it. My primary concern on a daily basis was that I was going to get captured and locked up someplace where they didn't serve alcohol, because I had to have it. But fortunately for me, it stopped working. It just really, where at one time it would settle the fear, it would settle the anxiety. It actually came to a place where it caused more, and then the guilt, when the guilt set in, you know, it actually, there was just, it actually made it worse. So that's where I was when I turned. Some people in 1976, you're too young to remember, but back in the day, some people were running a religious campaign. They called it whatever they was. They had bumper stickers that said, "I found it." And I saw those bumper stickers all over town. And one day, in a particular tough day, I called them and see what they had in mind. And they were very nice, and I didn't think much of it. They sent me a little pamphlet in the mail, which I didn't think much of until that one night that everything kind of came together. At one time, everything I'd used to make me feel better, it made me feel worse. And I read that little pamphlet, and it said to the effect that even if you don't believe in God, if you ask him for help, he'll help you anyway.
That's profound.
Oh my God. And I didn't have anything to lose by trying it. And if you can picture a big old 275-pound baby rolling out of his bed onto his knees, crying out to God that he didn't believe, quote, didn't believe in, for help. And I will tell you, I had an amazing experience that night. I had a peace that came over me that night like I'd never experienced before in my life, ever. And I will say, you know, based on that, I was able to stop the self-destruction. I was able to stop drinking and started stopping eating and losing weight. I started losing weight. But I will tell you, that was only the barest of beginnings. That was only just the barest of beginnings, because I still had to grow up. There I was 32 years old. I was a father, a husband, a homeowner, a businessman, a veteran, and I had the emotional development of an infant, because I'd been using something my entire life to cope with the life that was too much for me. So that's where I started, and that was on my knees. And frankly, I start every one of my days today on my knees, and I end my days on my knees. So anyway, that's where I'm at with that. I just, you know, I did a number of, I sought help from a lot of people, got a little bit of help from a lot of people, got a lot of help from a few people, but I could never find any place or anyone or any group or any organization that had all I needed. So, and I am a seeker. I'm still a seeker. But what I had to do is started gathering pieces from various teachers and people and teachings, and implement it in my life, use what I could use, discard what I couldn't use. And then ultimately, that's the beginning of the Nelson method. And I and I realized that I needed to be helpful to somebody. I didn't feel like I had a lot to offer in a spiritual way, but I'd do anything I could to help somebody. I'd pick up a hitchhiker and give him a ride and give him some money, whatever I had to do, to anything I could do. If someone help someone with their bags, anything I could do, because I knew I had to be helpful. And I didn't know really how. And then eventually I started trying to be helpful to someone who had similar problems that I had. And some people started getting results. And then I started realizing that maybe there was something working through me, a gift that I had to offer. And that was the beginning.
Roy, thank you so much for sharing this story, and it's so dramatic. I mean, it really is so dramatic when you talk, and in your book, the Love Notes from Hell, you go through more of your journey, which is, it's just powerful. And I think the God journey is like, I grew up with strong faith. I was either going to be a nun, a ballerina, or a doctor, right? So I became a doctor by default, is what I always but, just loving God, loving the Blessed Mother. And then through trauma, personal trauma experienced at 38 years old, I fell away from God. And I fought, like you said, beginning and end my day, and throughout the day, constant gratitude with God. And I won't leave God's embrace, because I know what it feels like to be out of it, to be off the path, right? And as and even for the strongest, I thought I was the strongest believer, I lost my son, my only son, in a tragic accident. And I was like, well, God, how have I been doing you think I've been doing everything right? How can this, happen? And just went through this whole spiritual hell, this physical hell, this emotional hell, relational hell. And I know that, I know without a hair of doubt that I will stay in God's, I say an audience of one, right? This is an audience of one, that what I do should please God, right? And I think in so many ways, I make mistakes every day, right? I'm total flawed in so many ways, totally imperfect, but just that discipline of living to serve others, to nourish the temple, to heal the temple that God has given us, to embrace our spirit, and to allow our spiritual power through God, or God consciousness, to work through us to help other people.
Absolutely. That's the only hope. That's my only hope, for sure.
Yeah, mine too. And it's a big part of health and healing. I wanted to talk to you more about the PTSD. Like, what happens? What happens when we have this trauma and we lose our minds? I mean, I've been studying the physiology, the neuroscience. I've been getting into that from your experience and the way you work with clients. Mm-hmm. What is happening, and how do you help trauma sufferers? And you, as we said this before we were on the line, that people with addictive behavior have had trauma in one sort or another.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, most everybody, most everybody I work with had childhood trauma, that they weren't emotionally equipped to handle. They, obviously had feelings brought up in them that were too much for them, and as I certainly did. But, my experience is that fear is the entire problem, and love is the entire solution. And as you well know, written in ancient script, in fear, in love, there is no fear, and perfect love casts out fear. And so, for me, as perfect of love as I can picture is unselfish love, that is sincere concern for the well-being of another without any agenda. So yeah, it's just a process. For me, it's really, my process has really been about unlearning. For me, my experience is you don't really need to go looking for the truth. And what I realized that You really need to look for the untruth, the myth, the faulty idea, the faulty belief, faulty philosophy, faulty data that we've gathered. And, if we can excavate that, then if we can excavate everything that isn't love, then the PTSD will be gone, in my experience. And I'm not a doctor and I don't practice medicine, so I don't want to get into that, that area there. But my experience with it is that, it's all, that's my solution for it. I couldn't find a solution in the circles that I was traveling in, but and again, I'm light years from being where I'd like to be, so I don't mean to imply that I'm that I've arrived, because there is there is no arrival in my experience. So I'm a seeker.
I like that description of being a seeker, and that excavating fear and all that is not love. That's truly profound. You also said fear is the entire problem, and in love is the entire solution. That is powerful. So, what are first initial steps that you help people in your Nelson method of healing?
I'm sorry. Forgive me. I stepped. I'm sorry. I thought you. Please finish.
No, I was just, to go over some of the initial stages of healing, the initial things that our listeners today, first I think it's awareness that what I'm experiencing is an addictive behavior, and that some of the sex addiction, I think, is oxytocin seeking, right? You've PTSD, you've disassociated. When we talk about the medical side of things, we look at the hormonal connections and disconnections, right? Disconnect between the hormones. And so a lot of sex addiction is oxytocin seeking, is trying to develop those love pathways.
Absolutely.
Through pain, whether it's through pleasure, and certainly pain seeking too, is that compensating factor, right? The same area in the brain that lights up for fear lights up for orgasm or climax. So for us to have climax, for many women to have climax, we have to eliminate fear, and that's a huge thing to understand. I think too, with sex addiction as well.
Absolutely. No, it's so true. My experience, first off, most of us have had early childhood sexual experiences that oftentimes the very people that were telling us our sexuality was bad were the very ones who were stoking our sexual feelings. And so it's but again, my experience is whether a person has actually had physical childhood sexual abuse or not, they can certainly have childhood sexual abuse through being told it's bad, or being told they're bad, or they're, whatever it is, because or even and many things that we learned weren't even said necessarily. For very sensitive receivers, we can easily take on an idea that we perceived was being said, or that we perceived it was being taught. But as far as we've all had trauma of one sort or another. Most of the people like me are very sensitive, and at the same time very fearful, but beyond that, it really doesn't matter where a person is coming from. In my experience with the work I do, it really doesn't. If they're coming from Yale or from jail or from Park Avenue or Park Bench, it really, it's the same. We start with the same process. Most people who have drinking problems think alcohol is their problem. Most people who have eating problems think food is their problem. Most people who have sex problems think sex is their problem. And the truth is, they're all symptoms. The problem, the disease, is deep within. And so what we first have to, the first part of my process is obviously have people come to me. I do a 28-day program, face-to-face, one-on-one, and they don't live with me, but they come visit with me each day, and I spend as much time with them as needed. But essentially what we're doing is helping them to, first off, to feel safe enough to really to look within and realize that the problem is much deeper than the addiction or the eating disorder or whatever it may be, that is deep within, the sex addiction or whatever. And then once we start to realize that it's much deeper, then we start doing what we call the discovery, what I call the discovery process and acceptance and the discovery. You know, in a legal case, they do discovery work to determine whether they have a big enough case where they think they have a case to go forward with. I do discovery work with people to help them determine whether they have a big enough problem, whether they need God or not. Because, you know, if a person thinks they can do it themselves, then obviously they're not going to be necessarily interested in a higher, you know, a higher authority. And then when I talk about God, I just want to say it's really important for me to make sure that people understand I'm not talking about some faraway God, some bearded man in the sky with a clipboard or whatever it may be. I'm talking about the sweet spirit that resides deep within each person, that we're talking about, and even you could even call it your higher self if you like. Because the addiction and the, you know, these various things that we're using is treating the lower self, whereas what we're really looking to get in touch with is the higher self, which is a higher authority and override the cravings and the various and sundry things that cause us to hurt ourselves.
You know, that's looking within and going through discovery and recognizing a connection with a higher self, you know, that connection with God, as those are the initial steps in your healing process.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
now, go ahead. Sorry.
And so that's how you start your 28-day journey.
Mm-hmm. Right. And at that point, if we discover we need a bigger solution than we've been able to find so far, then what we do is we at that point, as a turning point, a pivot point, if you will, that we claim, that we reach out and we claim, you know, the recovery. And then at that point, we start to do the excavation process. And there's writing. We do a lot of writing. We have you know, what we're really talking about doing is feeling the feelings, and that is having a person feel safe enough to look within and feel the feelings, to feel the pain, to feel the fear, to feel the guilt and the shame, all that stuff that's causing us to have to hurt ourselves by things, you know, because the addictions, the eating disorders, whatever, people oftentimes can't see. They can only see what it's doing for them. They can't oftentimes see what it's doing to them. And we're you know, basically helping them to feel safe enough to look and actually see what's going on. And so we do the excavation, and then we start, and of course that's a process, of course, and we do the excavation, and then we basically you know, go into the expansive living and reach out for a bigger life.
So are these here your 5 pillars of healing?
Yes, ma'am, they sure are.
So can you go over them again? 5.
Yeah, well, acceptance of the problem, and then doing the discovery work, and then claiming recovery, and then doing the excavation, and then the expansive living. Expansive
living sounds beautiful. Describe that.
Well, most of us have gotten, a lot of us have gotten into our lives have gotten really small. If we're crippled by phobias, for example, there have been people who have not been out of their house for years. Now, fortunately, I was a little bit better than I could go a little ways, but I mean, I was crippled by phobias. And even though I had traveled all over the world, and I mean, not all over the world, but I had traveled to lots of places in the world, I got to a place where I was really almost immobilized by phobias. And at least within a short range, I had a certain sphere of safety. But it's just there's a much bigger there's a big opportunity. What I'm offering here is a limitless opportunity, and literally it's limited only by someone's desire and imagination. Because my experience is connecting with the spirit. It literally is limitless, and we all have gifts and talents and abilities to offer to the world. And I'm about helping people get in touch with those gifts within themselves that they have to offer. In fact, one of my more recent clients is actually she's a widow, and she's written a book now to help other widows and help people know how to help widows, for example, who are in distress. And just there's a lot of different things that people are doing to be of service in the world, because that's really where we get I'm 80% of what we're looking to do is become givers. A lot of us have been takers, even though I did some good things in my other life, and most people did. In most cases, each person is uniquely qualified to be with a particular gift, a particular something they have to offer to the world. And I'm about helping them get in touch with that.
That's a beautiful thought, a beautiful statement to own, that each of us can own that we have a really beautiful gift, God-given gift, and that allowing that to be expansive, to be limitless, to tap into or to flow within our imagination, and trust, right? To trust that this is the path that we can be on, we can successfully be on, that it's right for us, versus all the fears, should not, could not, would nots, that can hold us back like serious chainage, right?
Yes,
Roy, you see people, I know you've had clients from all over the world, and many people come with a lot of the food addiction, the excess weight.
Yes, ma'am.
And those issues. So is it the same things underlying all that? How do you address those clients?
Well, the exact same way. I mean, it's actually those are the, I love working with people that way, because so many of us I personally didn't have a lot of experience in trying to control my weight because I knew I couldn't. So I'd only been on a couple of diets in my life, and one was when I was 18 years old in the Army, and I went on a diet one time at noon, and I lasted till about 2 p.m. And then another time, some years later, I was about 260, and another fellow was about 170, but he needed to lose a little weight. So I went on a Dr. Stillman's diet to help him out, and we ate steaks and boiled eggs and cottage cheese for 2 weeks, and I lost a little bit of water. But I didn't have any experience in trying to control my weight because, like I said, I knew I couldn't. But my experience is in this process, if a person will let me into their heart and let me surround them with love. And I see people like us have a big wall of fear around our heart. And we have feelings we thought we shouldn't have, so we pretend we don't have them. And then we don't have feelings we thought we should have, so we try to pretend we have them. And we're in complete turmoil within ourselves. But what I'm about is helping people feel safe enough to get real and get honest about how they actually feel. And what happens as this process begins, usually within the first day or so, the cravings are lifted. The cravings for excess food are gone. And or the craving to, or to wanting to starve ourselves, or whatever the particular eating disorder may be. Although they're all the same, they're just a different place on the same spectrum. A lot of people who, were perhaps a little bit overweight, or somebody told them they looked like they were, and they became anorexic as a young girl, and some boys too, in which I've experienced men with anorexia and bulimia as well. But then when they lose control of the restricting, then oftentimes when they lose control of that, they become bulimic. And then oftentimes when they lose control of that, then they start putting on weight. And not everybody starts off anorexic or bulimic, but oftentimes it happens that way. But it doesn't really matter. I mean, one fellow was between 500 and 600 pounds, and he was at Cedars-Sinai weight management program, and the nurses over there referred him over to us, and he's about 185 now. He's about 6 foot, a lot, 6'5" or 6 or something. He's about 185 now, and he recently contacted me, and he said he's gotten a pay raise bigger than his annual salary used to be. So he's pretty happy with his results he's getting. So it doesn't really matter how overweight, or in fact, frankly, I've seen people more desperate to get rid of 10 pounds, if they've been thin, for example, and they're gaining weight. I've seen people as desperate to get rid of 5 or 10 pounds as they were 100 pounds. And so many obese people like myself, so many people who are morbidly obese just settle into what Thoreau called lives of quiet desperation. But my experience is it really doesn't matter how much weight a person has to lose. If they work with me, they can effortlessly lose it.
Mm. Well, one thing that you talk about regularly is about how to stop denying your desires, right? Because I think there's that sense of, okay, if you have alcohol addiction, just stop the alcohol. Food addiction, just stop the food. Go cold turkey, stop the sex addiction, just shut your, like you said, deny your desires, deny that off. So, what's the reasoning, the philosophy behind that?
Well, I was just on a Skype call with a woman in Abu Dhabi a couple of nights ago, and her contract is up in June, and she's coming to see me for the 28-day program, and she'll obviously stay a lot longer than that. And that's another thing is for people who come for the 28-day program, and if they're serious and want to keep going, I continue to work with them at no additional charge for as long as they want to work. So, but she's eating and she's drinking because she's in tremendous pain, and we visited with her on Skype, and frankly, I want to get back to her and tell her just to go ahead and enjoy her food and her liquor, for the time being, because if you're not gonna, I mean, for me, fighting it is an exercise in futility. I mean, literally trying to, for me, trying to fight food or try to fight any of it is alcohol, sex addiction, or anything else. I mean, it's completely hopeless, in and of myself. So, it's just, but ultimately what happens here is a person will lose their appetite for anything that isn't good for them, and they'll be given an appetite for things that are good for them in amounts that are good for them. So that's my only hope. I'm a hopeless case, and I can't control any of it.
I think that recognition, it's like, I'm hopeless without God, right?
Absolutely, yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Apart from divine help, I'm a goner, completely hopeless.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's beautiful that you're doing your mission work here and you're living out your purposes passionately. I just love that from you. Tell me, you wrote this very dramatic title, Love Notes from Hell. And you're so exposed in this book, right? And you share so much of your vulnerability, your story, your road through hell. Honestly, it's tremendous work. So tell us a little bit about this book, why you wrote it, why people should read it, and also where they can connect more with you? I know the book's available on Amazon and also at your website at roynelsonhealing.com. But
well, interestingly enough, people had been telling me for probably 3 decades that I should be writing a book. And I thought that was nice, but I didn't think it was going to happen. I just didn't. But ultimately, we'd hired ghostwriters over the years, and one thing and another. And eventually, we hired a branding lady that demanded a book. So, and once again, she hired a ghostwriter to write it for me, and she couldn't get it. She couldn't get my voice to Trisha's satisfaction. So Trisha decided she's going to write it herself. So Trisha wrote that book for me in a month.
Nice.
And then we spent a month editing it, and that's how that book came about. And the title is a gentleman who branded me. Basically, that was his title and his picture. They got that picture of me before the shoot started. I was just sitting there, waiting for get the lights right, and he clicked me unsuspecting. And they shot the rest of the day, but that's the one they chose, was the one they shot before the shoot started.
Isn't that funny? Oh, that's fantastic. And for our listeners, Trisha is his beautiful wife and fantastic, beautiful spirit as well.
She absolutely is. She's an angel. Trisha came to me for some help. I don't know if you know the story, but Trisha came to me when she was 21 years old for some help for an eating disorder. She had about 50 pounds overweight, and she'd been a blackout drunk from when she was 14, but she wasn't heavy into alcohol at the time. But anyway, so she came to me for some help, and we, she got some help, and at the time, I was working with some other people and some other women, and she really saw some good things happening. And if you can picture this as a 21-year-old, Trisha envisioned having a big house someplace where people could come and get help. That was what she envisioned when she was just a very young woman. And so she adopted me, and we've been on this path together for all these years. And frankly, all of this is on account of her. I mean, none of this would be. I'd still be helping people in the back, without. I had to do the work, but I was never going to make a business out of it or anything big out of it. And so, and obviously, it's through Trisha having met you that we're even doing this thing today. So, Thank you so much. Thanks so much to you, and thanks so much to Trisha.
Yeah, absolutely. It's divine interventions, right? Need to hear. You've given us some really good messages, and I want, I know at roynelsonhealing.com for your website, and they can learn more about the Nelson method, 28 days to freedom, and just love that word freedom. And I just want to reiterate some notes that I took during our talk is that, fear is, I want to say this quote from you because I just love it. Fear is the entire problem, and in love is the entire solution. And I say that with a very God-centered focus. And that is so beautiful. And that for those, like you said, you were on your knees, an unbeliever, and that if, what inspired was you, that even if you don't believe it, pray to God and he'll help you. Even if you don't believe in him, pray to God, or, believe in God, pray to God and help you. So I think that is so key. The other thing that, was touched me too is that addicted people with addictive behaviors are sensitive people. You feel things empathetically more deeply, like empaths, just naturally feel other people's pain, other people's suffering, and are self-medicating with these addictions, right? We talked about, self-medicating, oxytocin-seeking behaviors, for instance, in whatever form. Other self-medicating behaviors, and how that fear, anxiety, guilt can just pile up in layers and cause eating disorders, emotional disorders, and all the addictive behaviors that you've talked about. And I've heard your legacy, right, of restoration, your legacy of peaceful restoration, and that that restoration of your holy self with complete forgiveness, right?
Yes,
and that's so key. And I just amazed. So any closing words of inspiration that you'll leave, any additional, you've left us with so much, but thank you first of all for sharing your journey. Everyone, RoyNelsonHealing.com, and words of any final words of inspiration.
It's all grace.
In grace, absolutely.
It's all grace.
Well, thank you. Tell Tricia I say hello and send my love. And to everyone listening, this is Dr. Anna Cabeca, drAnnaCabeca.com. So stay tuned for additional couch talks. We have our iTunes podcast at Cabeca Health, so Cabeca Health. And you can log on to CabecaHealth.com, take my oxytocin quiz, go to RoyNelsonHealing.com, check out his book, Love Notes from Hell. Also, you can order this on Amazon. So I want to thank all our listeners today. Thank you very much, Roy, for being part of our show today and sharing your story. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you.